Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to VSPG. We have a presentation today from Professor Nadja Drabon, the effects of a Paleoarchean meteorite impact on early surface environments and life. We have, I think, just one, we've had a schedule change, so we only have one more presentation this year, just next week. Andre and I had well, we were pending on some travel plans, and those travel plans ended up such that we aren't really confident where we're going to be those last 2 weeks of the schedule. So we have rescheduled Mohammed and Athena to, well, we're working on that for after the new year. So with that, I don't have any more announcements. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Nadja for us. All right. Dr. Nadja Drabon's research applies sedimentology and geochemistry to questions revolving around the habitability of early Earth, early crustal processes, and changing surface environments. She has worked extensively on sedimentary rock from the Barberton Greenstone Belt, developing our understanding of crustal formation in the Hadean. She studies Archean tectonic processes recorded in the siliciclastic successions from the Fig Tree Basin, and also how meteorite impacts affect early Earth habitability, which we'll learn about today. Nadja completed her bachelor's in geology at the Free University of Berlin in Germany, applying geothermometry and the Archean Moody's group with Professor Christoph Webeck. For her PhD at Stanford, she studied the crustal setting, provenance, and sedimentation in the Paleoarchean Barberton Greenstone Belt with Professor Don Lowe. And since, she's completed 2 postdoctoral research appointments at Stanford and Harvard before starting her current position as assistant professor at Harvard University. This is where she continues her research and teaches subjects related to sedimentology, field geology, life evolution through time, and Precambrian geology. So we're really excited to have you, Nadja. We're excited to hear you present. So please go ahead and take it away.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. So this talk today is really coming from our long-standing interest on the Archean surface environment and how the habitability of the early Earth was affected by meteorite impacts. So quite a bit of work has been done on the early impact record and how that might have affected the surface environment, especially in the Barberton Greenstone Belt. And here, this is, as far as I'm aware, the first time that we are trying to tie this directly to how life might have reacted to it. So just to get us started, here's a map of the Earth showing impact craters that we see today. So there are about 200 impact craters preserved on Earth today, ranging in size from less than 1 kilometer in diameter to over 200 kilometers in diameter. The biggest one, of course, is the Fredefort crater. So this impact happened about 2 billion years ago, and it generated a crater that's about 300 kilometers in diameter. The most famous impact, of course, is the Chicxulub impact that happened about 65 million years ago and caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. So the effect of a giant impact on life is going to be dependent on a number of different aspects. So of course, it's the size of the bolide and the composition, then the target rock, the current environmental conditions prior to the impact, and then what life was like. So how complex was life, for example. So the KPG meteorite impact is associated with a mass extinction event, and some of the really disastrous consequences of the impact are related to the target rock. So the bolide that was about 10 kilometers in diameter hit a carbonate platform. So that ejected a lot of carbon and sulfate into the atmosphere. This caused a really significant drop in temperature, about 15 degrees Celsius, followed by longer-term warming by, perhaps 0.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius. There's probably a short-term global darkness. There was acid rain. Of course, we have the generation of a tsunami and abundant earthquakes. As an effect, more than 60% of Cretaceous species went extinct at this boundary. On the other side, of course, there were a few opportunistic species that were able to bloom after the impact. And then lastly, some species were able to radiate. So I would always argue that this impact was the best thing that could have happened to us, because without it, mammals wouldn't have radiated and we probably wouldn't be here. Another really complex aspect of this impact is that it likely caused the secession, or not the secession, but a really strong drop in primary productivity in the oceans. And as a result, the breakdown of the carbon isotope gradient within the oceans. And this is why we are seeing this delta 13C shift here going towards more negative values. Of course, today we don't have to worry so much about impacts the size because they would only occur statistically about once every 250 million years. Of course, if we go further back in time, especially into the Precambrian world, the impact rate was much higher. So here I'm showing impact flux model by Mark et al. From 2021. And so you're looking here at the mass accreted versus time. So of course, early on, the impact rate was really high, slowly dropping through time. And the reason I'm showing you this diagram here, because in blue, here's reconstructing the most likely impact flux related to actually preserved impact record on the Earth from spheroidal beds. So what does that look like? So here's a big table. The details don't really matter so much, but it's just showing you the number of impact events that have been documented through time. And in blue here, you can see Precambrian impact events. So Glass and Simonsen did this compilation in 2012. And for the Archean, there are about 16 impact events that have been identified. And most of these by these thin spheroidal beds. So a spheroidal bed forms associated with an impact because the bolide hits the Earth, it vaporizes the bolide itself, but also some of the target rock. It forms a rock vapor cloud that travels the globe and then rains out as these small sand-sized grains that we then find in these spheroidal beds. So this is a relatively thin spheroidal bed here. So this is 1 centimeter in comparison. Many of the ones that we see in the Archean are significantly thicker than that. And I should note, just to tune you in a little bit, there's a spheroidal bed associated with a KPG impact, but that spheroidal bed, the distal deposits are typically no thicker than 1 centimeter in diameter. So we are talking here about significantly bigger impacts. So how did these impacts affect the early life in the early surface environment? And this has been something that has been looked at for quite a while, because of course we think about the habitability during the Hadean and the Archean. And for a long time, impacts were seen really as disastrous, that they could annihilate the early life. And certainly that's true for something like the moon forming impact. But there's many reasons to believe that smaller impacts could actually have some benefits to life. So for example, the bolides might be carrying really important components like amino acids to Earth. You might have shock synthesis of some really important compounds. And then, of course, when you look at craters here, those could actually also generate environments that are really wonderful for prebiotic chemistry and life. And that is in part because you start generating hydrothermal systems. You're really shocking the ground. You're increasing porosity and permeability, allowing more fluid flow and, potentially opening up new environments for life to form. So with this, Osinski et al. In 2020 did kind of this really big compilation, this big paper talking about some of the positive effects of the early impacts. And they argue that impact events are not just isolated catastrophic geological events, but a fundamental process in planetary evolution that plays an important role in the origin of life and in controlling planetary habitability. So this is interesting, of course, this is great. So me as a geologist, of course, I'm interested in actually going into the field and collecting rocks and seeing, can we find any evidence for any positive or negative effect of these impacts? So the first problem that we are seeing here is that a lot of the beneficial effects that have been proposed are really very local and associated with the crater. But if you look at this diagram here, so this says source crater, you see unknown, unknown, unknown. So we don't know where the impact hit. We don't have a preserved Archean impact crater, but really what we are talking about is the distal deposits. For all we know, we might be really on the other side of the Earth. However, this is still really interesting because now we can study what was the effect, not just locally, but potentially on a more global scale of these impacts on the environment and life. So for this, I decided to study the S2 impact event in the Barberton Greenstone Belt, and that is for several reasons. So firstly, the spheroids, as you can see them shown here, are really well preserved. And in general, in the Barberton Greenstone Belt, the metamorphic grade is relatively low for Archean rocks. It's about 320 degrees Celsius. And on top of that, a lot of the sediment was silicified early that allowed for really excellent preservation. So with these spheroids here, you see these beautiful crystallization textures, you see barred textures, devitrification textures. They're really excellently preserved. And then secondly, Barberton really has a rich history of meteorite impacts. So just to back up for 1 second. So the Barberton Greenstone Belt is located in northeastern South Africa at the border to Eswatini. And it's composed of 3 different stratigraphic groups, the Onverbrugge group, the Victory group, and the Moody's group. The rocks were deposited between about 3.55 and 3.2 billion years ago. And within them, we find evidence for at least 8 meteorite impact events. So all of these, the bolides are thought to have been larger than 20 kilometers in diameter. I do want to emphasize that these are only the impact events that we have identified so far. Most likely, we are missing a huge amount of impacts, and this is really the minimum number. So in my research, I'm focusing on the S2 impact event that is recorded here in the uppermost Menden Formation. And the estimates for the bolide size really vary. So people usually use the thickness of the spheroid bed to get at the bolide size. The bolide size, the estimated varies between about 20 to over 100 kilometers in diameter. I would say what is most often cited is an estimate by Johnson and Meloche from 2012, and they suggest about 37 to 58 kilometers in diameter. Just to put this into perspective, so here we have got the KPG bolide, which was about 10 kilometers in diameter. So here there's 2 bolide, 37 kilometers. Again, this is one of the lower estimates for the bolide. So we really have this enormous rock raining down on Earth and creating a crater that was likely 500 kilometers in diameter or bigger. So now, of course, this begs the question. We've got this huge bolide raining down on Earth. What was the effect on the surface environment, and what was the effect on life? So for this, I studied 2 sections in the central part of the Barberton Greenstone Belt. Overall, the S2 spheroid bed, I'm showing it here in blue, can be traced in several different structural belts, and I'm focusing in on the Bruces Hill section and the Umba Umba section, which are now about 10 kilometers apart. But there's a big fault running through right here. So although they're now only 10 kilometers apart, they're likely very much further apart back in the Archean. So as I mentioned, the S2 meteorite impact event is recorded in the uppermost Menden Formation. So the Menden Formation was deposited between 3.33 to 3.26 billion years ago. And it's composed of up to 5 cycles of ultramafic volcanic activity, so komatiites, and those then kept by thinner units of banded chert. The topmost banded cherts of the Menden Formation have been really studied in detail by Lizzie Trower and Dawn Lowe. And they see up to 70 meters of strata that is dominated by black and white banded chert and some banded ferruginous chert. There's abundant organic matter within these sections, and some of it, as you can see in this photograph here from Trower and Doe 2016, shows these really beautiful laminations that are draping the surface, as you can see here. So they're forming topography. They show a cohesion when we worked, indicating that at least some life was present. And this is a point that's going to be important later in the talk, is that there's evidence for an iron 2+ rich deep and an iron 2+ depleted shallow water. And then lastly, this is again important, just thinking about the origin of the organic matter, because organic matter can form through fissure tropes. But after extensive fieldwork by Lizzie and Dawn, they found no evidence for extrusive vents or hydrothermal mounts and no polymetallic deposits. So kind of start helping you guys visualize what the environment was like. Again, we have got the iron-enriched deeper water, the iron-depleted shallower water here. And then we have a biosphere active. That's what I'm indicating with these green blobs here. But the biosphere was probably not as prolific as it is today. So to show you roughly where I would position the two sections that I measured, there would be above this chemocline in the iron-depleted waters with the Bruce's Hill section and slightly shallower waters compared to the Umba section. And I'm going to tell you why. So here you can see the two sections. So in blue, this is the S2 spheroid bed containing a bunch of spheroids. And then below, I measured about 5 meters of section and then up to 8 meters above the impact event. So the two sections below the impact showed different characteristics. In the Bruce's Hill section, in the black and white banded chart, we quite frequently see these cross laminations indicating some relatively low to moderate energy currents. And then on top of that, we see quite a bit of siliciclastic debris, indicating that we are, closer, or we have access to a siliciclastic source here. Then, of course, you see some of these really beautiful carbonaceous laminations. In contrast, the Umba section looks different. So in thin section, we see a lot of these carbonaceous laminations, some a little bit thicker, parts reworked. When we do see sandy beds, they're exclusively composed of intraclasts. And we don't see any cross laminations, but we do see chert plate conglomerates that have been previously interpreted as being storm deposits. So overall, this is suggesting that the Bruce's Hill section might have been somewhat shallower compared to the Umba section, but even in the Umba section, we are still above storm wave phase. So then we've got the impact event, S2. So in both sections, the S2 spheroids are found in a conglomeratic sandstone that is really rich in these big chert clasts, indicating a really high energy event associated with the impact. And on top of that, these two sandy beds here are broadly normally graded, indicating that the flows behave sort of like surges. The way this has been interpreted for S2, but also essentially all Archean spheroid beds, is that these reflect tsunami deposits. So when you have an impact during the Archean, the bolide is more likely to hit water than exposed crust. So, and because the bolides are so large, they essentially displace the entire water column, generating this enormous tsunami sweeping by. And that would be ripping up the seafloor and resedimenting material. Above the S2 spheroid bed in both sections, and so that's not only for these, but also in general for S2 and S3 and also S1 in the Barberton area, we find this about 1 meter thick black chert bed. So this black chert is broadly normally graded. This is what it looks like in the field. It's black because it contains quite a bit of organic matter, but it's also actually quite rich in just like really fine-grained siliciclastic material. The way we interpret this is that it's part of the same event, that's the passage of the tsunami, and with the tsunami sweeping by, ripping up the ocean floor, bringing a lot of light organic stuff into suspension. This is going to take a little while to settle out of suspension. And that is what we are seeing here. The Bruce's Hill section is interesting because above the fallout layer, we see at least 2 more relatively thick sandstone beds that are full of spheroids. So here in this image, you can see the top of the fallout layer, really sharp contact, and then the sandstone containing these impact-derived spheroids. This bed here is still broadly normally graded. You see a decrease in current energy. There's another black chert indicating potentially another fallout layer. And then perhaps we even have a third sandstone bed here. And this third sandstone bed is actually the one that has the highest concentration of spheroids out of all sandstone beds that we are looking at here. So we're not 100% sure yet what this means, but some possibilities are that, we have this giant tsunami. It might be traveling the globe. It might be reflected on some kind of high-standing crust or you might have the earthquakes triggering more tsunamis, or maybe even eventually the tsunami traveling across the globe and coming back. Yeah. So next, I want us to focus in on the top of the fallout layer in the umbel section here, because this is where we find these really curious crystallites. So you can see these crystallites here, they're beautifully euhedral. They come in all sorts of different shades. These are really highly unusual because it's not something that we otherwise see in the Mendon Formation. So I talked to Lizzie about it. She has never seen something like this before in all of the thin sections she has looked at. And the euhedral shape is interesting because it in part indicates that there was really minimal sedimentary, like abrasion during sedimentary transport. Unfortunately, it's difficult to see what the original composition was because they're all replaced by silica now. But we can look at these in a little bit more detail to see what's going on. So in general, just to back up for a second, I see two different types of these crystallites. So the first type is within the top of the fallout layer. As we can see here, then there's a minor erosional surface here. And then above that, we see this bed with really densely packed crystallites. So to understand a little bit better where these are coming from, now we did just a few measurements. So when we look at the crystallites that we find in the top of the fallout layer, we can see that they have a similar size distribution for different samples. And what is most notable is that they are larger than the largest clastic grain that we find within the sediment. So this indicates that they are not in hydrodynamic equilibrium with the surrounding sediment. The type 1 crystallites, so the one that are on top of the fallout layer, are the same size, but generally tending towards a smaller size here. Then we can look at the crystal habit, right? We're interested, okay, are these crystals that we see on top here, maybe they're just the reworked material of that where we have funneled out all the organic matter. What is interesting, however, is that again, the crystals are really euhedral, indicating that there was very minimal sedimentary transport. And on top of it, they show different crystal habits, which might point towards a different origin. And then lastly, we can look at the crystal orientation. And then for the type 2 crystals here, we can see that they're essentially randomly oriented. Versus the type 1 crystallites here, they're clearly deposited parallel to bedding, indicating that there was actually, they were either transported by like really weak currents or that they may be settled out of the water column. So where are these coming from? So one possibility, and it's our current working hypothesis, is that these might actually represent evaporites from ocean evaporation associated with a meteorite impact. So Segura in 2013 did some modeling trying to see, okay, if we have got this giant impact, right, you have a lot of kinetic energy that is then transferred into thermal energy that will then heat up the atmosphere for, up to a year or so. And what they calculated is that an impact about the size of S2 would be able to evaporate potentially tens of meters of the water column. And then I should also mention that there's two other impact deposits within the Archean Greenstone Belt, where there are these silica crusts here that have been interpreted to reflect precipitation also from partial ocean evaporation after these impact events. So one possibility of how to interpret this means that we might have ocean evaporation. Because of this, we might be initiating evaporite formation. Some of these might be forming within the sediment as interstitial evaporites, hence the random orientation. And then these ones on top, they seem to have had a different origin. And one possibility is that, when you have ocean evaporation, it's going to be strongest right at the surface of the ocean. So this is where you might be nucleating evaporites that are then raining down. You see this today in herbaceous brine pools, and it's called rain from heaven, which sounds really peaceful, but I would assume in the aftermath of the S2 impact, probably wasn't that peaceful. So moving further up, so we've made it through the actual impact event and maybe the year or two after when things are really hot. What are things looking like now? So in terms of the sedimentology, we already start seeing above S2 the increase in iron, because we see a lot of these reddish churts above the impact event. So in the Bruce's Hill section above the second spheral bed, we start seeing this really unusual bed that is full of these grains here that are composed of just like minute, so sub-micron hematite grains that were reworked. And then as we go further up, we start seeing more and more siderite coming in. So here you can see one of these siderite-rich beds. In the Umba section, looks a little bit different because we go back what appears to be just like black and white banded chert again, but in contrast to before the impact event, we now see a lot more siliciclastic detritus, and we do see current structuring. And it's only after we lose this increased siliciclastic detritus is that we start seeing these siderite-rich deposits. Now, let's look at this in terms of the geochemistry. So here I'm looking at the aluminum content, because aluminum correlates generally with zirconium, chromium, thorium. So it's a good proxy for sediment input, so siliciclastic sediment input. What you can see that there's some variability in the Bruce's Hill section, but we have got about 2.7 weight% aluminum compared to much lower value here, 0.7 weight% in the Umba section, which is again broadly consistent with the Bruce's Hill being closer to a siliciclastic source, possibly in shallower water. And then as we go above the impact, in the Bruce's Hill section, statistically speaking, we don't see a change. However, I would like to point out that, of course, with the impact, we start seeing these relatively thick sandstone bodies that stay thick and much bigger than before the impact, but gradually decline in thickness as you go up section and then eventually vanish. In the Bruce's Hill section, we do see a really sharp rise in the aluminum content. So with the spheral bed, but then it stays high throughout the deposition of the fallout layer and the banded cherts above. And then only as we enter into these iron-rich sediments, we start seeing a decrease in the aluminum. So this means associated with the impact event, we see a temporary increase in siliciclastic sediment influx. So of course, we are thinking about the biosphere, right? And what I would like to point out that together with the increase in siliciclastic sediment influx, but also like really with the spheroids, we see an increase in phosphorus. And actually the sample with the highest phosphorus content is the sample with the highest concentration of spheroids. So I mentioned earlier, the third sandstone bed at Bruce's Hill has about 10% spheroids, and it contains 1,300 parts per million phosphorus compared to a background of 70 parts per million. So this is 20 times more than what we see beforehand. So it is possible that, you know, as you're vaporizing the bolide, and the bolide was likely a carbonaceous chondrite, you know, a lot of the phosphorus from the carbonaceous chondrite might have made it into the environment here. This leaves open, of course, the question how bioavailable the phosphorus was. So in terms of the siliciclastic material, we do see quite a bit of, you know, fine apatite grains going on here. So it's possible that some of it was bioavailable or was made bioavailable, especially in the really aggressive hot weathering regime right after the impact. Then next, we can look at the iron content. So both sections have similar iron content prior to the meteorite impact, about 0.5 weight%. And this again supports deposition above the chemocline. And then in the Bruce's Hill section, immediate with the impact event, we see an increase in iron that actually reaches its peak above the second spheral bed and then gradually declines. In the Umba section, there's a delay in the increase in iron. We see it increasing as soon as as the sediment influx starts receding here. So I should point out that, you know, the sections, I just didn't have any more rock available right above these points here, but I've sampled shales laterally, and I was able to see that, you know, the iron content doesn't stay high, so that it does go back down. So this is not something that we see long-term, at least not immediately after the impact. So where's this increase in iron coming from? It could be that we are just gradually deepening, so passing through the chemocline. It's possible that the impact triggered uplift and weathering of ultramafic crust, and that increased the iron. It's also possible that the impact triggered mafic volcanic or hydrothermal activity, And the last option that we've come up with is that the passage of the tsunami was able to mix the ocean and bring iron-enriched deep water to the surface. So going through them one by one, do we see any evidence for deepening? I would argue that we don't see any clear evidence for it. So here's just a photo from above S2 in the Bruce's Hill section, and you still see beautiful cross-bedding. We see erosional surfaces. We don't see any turbidite deposits or anything else that would make us think that we are potentially deepening here. In the Umba section, it's a little bit harder to tell because we really only have 80 centimeters of strata. In terms of grain size, it looks fairly similar to what we see before, but it's just a little harder to evaluate. So the next possibility is, do we see a change in hydrothermal activity, right? So it's been long documented that, you know, at least at the crater site itself, you generate a really active hydrothermal field, but is this something that might be happening on a more global scale? So here I'm looking at the normalized rare earth element concentration and looking at the europium anomaly. So today we would be roughly about 1. So we had 1.5, indicating that there was in general a higher hydrothermal input into the Archean Ocean. And this is something that is just generally seen. Any type of chemical sediment in the Archean does tend to have a higher hydrothermal signature, which is likely related to the higher heat flux from the mantle, just causing more hydrothermal activity in the oceans. So as we go above the impact event, there's just no statistically significant change. Again, I'm not doubting that there's some increase in hydrothermal activity close to the crater or within the crater, but we just don't see a strong signal this far away. Then lastly, do we see any evidence for an increase in mafic source rocks or increase in mafic volcanic activity? So for this here, I'm plotting the chromium over zirconium ratio. And so because chromium tends to go into mafic rocks and zirconium into more felsic rocks. So when we look at the data here, this is fairly typical of sort of a mixed mafic and felsic provenance. And then when we look across the impact event, again, there's no really statistically significant change. If at all, in the Bruce's Hill section, it looks like it might be slightly more felsic. So with that, I would argue that the most parsimonious explanation for the increase in iron is the mixing of the water column. So the idea is here that the tsunami is sweeping by and really bringing up the iron-rich deep waters closer to the surface. And to just like summarize this part of my talk, you know, the environmental effects of the impact on the surface environment. So clearly we see evidence for tsunami sweeping by. There's some potential evidence for partial ocean evaporation. We see evidence for an increase in weathering and erosion and an increase in iron in shallow water environments. So now coming back to the big question of the talk, and that is, was there any measurable effect on early life? And again, I won't claim that we have fully answered these questions, but we do have some tantalizing data that might hint at a possible effect on the biosphere. So firstly, we of course don't see any microfossils or anything. And in terms of the nature of the organic matter, a lot of it is just these clots and clumps or fine laminations that are, you know, pretty tricky to interpret directly. So the proxy that we are mostly going to focus on is the carbon isotopic signature. So life is carbon-based. It prefers the lighter carbon isotope over the heavier, resulting in this relatively negative carbon isotopic signature. And there's different metabolic pathways that impart different ranges of carbon isotopes, at least in the modern. And when we look at the data from the Menin formation together, it ranges between about -27 to -39. Which is in agreement potentially with the Calvin cycle and the Jungdahl cycle. So what does our data look like? So when I first got the data, I was a little concerned because as I look at it here below the impact event, we see a lot of scatter, right? It's relatively light, again, -28 to about -36, and a lot of scatter. But actually, this is fairly typical for Archean cherts. So whether that's the buckreef chert or Menin formation or Kronberg formation, these are the typical results that people get. And this is really hard to attribute to like one unique process that's happening, but how it's often interpreted is that you had some limited amount of primary productivity in the oceans, and then a lot of respiring heterotrophs or fermentation going on, possibly methanogenesis, methanotrophy, and that's why you see these scatter and relatively light values. So then let's look at the fallout layer. And I think it's really remarkable how the signal shifts. So beforehand, there's a lot of scatter, and now the data clusters much more narrowly together. And you can see this most clearly in the booster cell section. And the way we're interpreting this is largely to reflect the tsunami really ripping up the seafloor, all of the organic matter that was already there, the dead organic matter in the seafloor, mixing it up, homogenizing it, and then this raining down. And then going to the top of the section, in the booster cell section, we can see we are going back to quite a bit of scatter, but it looks almost bimodal here. And then the Umba section, we generally appear to see a shift to heavier values. And again, here, like a little more homogeneous in the isotopic signature. So before I will go into how we are interpreting this data, we have to think about post-deposition alteration. These rocks are really old. They've been heated to 320 degrees Celsius. So is this data actually that we are looking at, is it like recording what was happening? Is it recording anything sort of pristine? So the first thing we need to worry about is metamorphism, because it can cause thermal cracking, and this will preferentially release the lighter carbon isotope. I would argue that this was probably not, this did not have a major effect on the data that we are seeing here. Firstly, because this is something that would act globally on the rocks, and we shouldn't be seeing this really stratigraphic dependency on the carbon isotope signature. And secondly, because the metamorphic grade is still pretty low. So with low Greenschutz grade metamorphism, we shouldn't see more than 3 per mole variability. So probably less than 3 per mole variability because of thermal cracking. Then secondly, there's of course the possibility of carbon migration. So if you form hydrocarbons and those might be migrating through cracks or porosity, and cherts are really rigid rocks. That means they fracture easily. So there's a lot of fracture folds that we find in these rocks. Most of the fracture folds are just chert. And we have 150 thin sections for these two sections. And I looked at them all really closely. I only found one single location where I thought there might have been a small amount of carbon within the crack. So I don't think this is like a major concern here. And then lastly, of course, we have to worry about equilibration with carbonates. But here again, this is something that typically happens at higher metamorphic grade. And when we look at the delta 13C versus the carbonate content, there's no clear variability. So overall, I think this is making me feel pretty good. So we can start thinking about what this data actually means. So firstly, I want to talk about any possible evidence for a negative effect on life. We have ocean evaporation. We probably have a lot of dust in the atmosphere that would have made things dark at the surface. We've got the tsunami sweeping by. So especially for phototrophs living in the uppermost water column, this probably would have been fairly disastrous. And I mentioned to you earlier that at the K-PG boundary, one of the most characteristic things is this negative shift in the carbon isotopes, reflecting the collapse of the carbon isotope gradient in the water column. So do we see any negative shift in the carbon isotopic signature? And for that, I would invite you to drink a beer or two, because maybe we see a shift. So when we look here at the fallout layer, zooming in here in the booster cell section, there's a moderate trend, possibly a decrease in the carbon isotopic signature by perhaps 0.5 per mole. And the Umba section, you know, the decrease might be bigger, you know, up to 2 per mole, but the correlation is really weak. So if this is real, right, what could be the cause of this trend? It could be what I was just mentioning, right? The reduction of primary productivity and the collapse of the carbon isotope gradient. However, I would argue that this is unlikely the cause, just because to even generate a carbon isotopic gradient in the water column in the DIC, you need relatively high productivity. And I would say everyone would agree, or most people would agree, that the biosphere was not that prolific in the Archean at this point. And secondly, we just have a really high PCO2. So there's a lot of carbon, really high DIC in the water column. So the productivity would have had to be even greater than it is today. So I think that's fairly unlikely. I think the more likely explanation here is, potentially size segregation. So here I'm plotting the carbon isotope data again in black, and then in red, the largest grain size that we find within the fallout layers. Again, the fallout layers show really clear normal grading here, and you can see that the two trends in both sections sort of correlate. What this could mean is that the larger organic matter particles might have been relatively heavier compared to the finer ones. And this is something that we see sometimes in the modern, and it may relate to different carbon sources or different degrees of degradation. And then on top of that, some of this very trend here might be related to mixing the concurrent carbon production. So you have the settling out of the stirred up water column, and then the biosphere might be kicking back in, generating more carbon. So that might also explain some of this trend. Then secondly, searching for any evidence for negative effect on the biosphere, we can look at the TOC, because perhaps everything in the ocean dies off, so we have a lot of carbon raining down onto the ocean floor. And when we look at the data here, so this is 0.1% total organic carbon, there is an increase associated with the fallout layer. But I would argue, the TOC can be affected by a lot of different things. It doesn't need to be necessary it doesn't necessarily need to be due to a mass die-off. And also the high TOC values are not unusual, right? We see them, for example, down here, 4 meters below the spheroid bed, associated with a black chert where we don't see a spheroid bed. So to put this all together, I don't think we see any clear evidence for, some sort of mass exodus of the microbes in the ocean at this time period. I would say that we're all fairly convinced that there were negative effects, because again, it would get dark, it would get really hot, and especially phototropes in the uppermost water column would be negatively affected. But this was probably relatively short-lived. So Andy likes to say, when you brush your teeth in the morning, you kill 99.9% of bacteria, but by the evening, they're all back. So even if it was dark and horrible conditions for a few years, the biosphere might be able to kick in again really rapidly. So maybe what one would need to do is do a study in much more detail. But even then, because of, like averaging and all of that, we might not be able to pick this up. So let me turn this around and let's start thinking about possible evidence for positive effects on life, right? So we see an increase in phosphorus, an increase in iron, and iron might have acted as an electron donor to the biosphere. So do we see any evidence for this? And I think we have some preliminary results that might suggest that we do. And there's 3 reasons why I'm saying this. So firstly, let me just color code the carbon isotopic data based on the geochemistry. So here again, aluminum for sediment input. So I'm distinguishing between samples that have low detrital input and those that have high detrital input. And then of course, we're really interested in iron. So here differentiating between low iron and high iron. These lines here are each 1.5 rate%. And I just chose these arbitrarily. So here's again the carbon isotope data of the organic matter. So now I'm color coding it based on the geochemistry. And what you can see that, in the Bruce's Hill section where I mentioned that the data looks almost bimodal, that, we have these samples here that are rich in iron and low and detrital input that have these really stable, about -29 per mole carbon isotopic signature. Compared to these over here that are lighter, that have a lot of detrital contamination. And then we look at the Umba section, and we again see that the samples that are high in iron and low in detrital contamination have relatively stable and relatively heavy carbon isotopic signature. So we can see this a little bit better almost here in these box plots, really showing the narrow distribution of the carbon isotopes. So the way I interpret the bimodality in the Bruce's Hill section is that these samples here, they have detritus associated with them, So this likely also includes a lot of reworked detrital organic matter, whether that's like reworked carbonaceous chert grains or like direct organic matter from the seafloor, that organic matter from the seafloor, as we are seeing, for example, below. So what I would argue here is that there appears to be some sort of connection between the carbon cycle and the increase in iron. And the shift in the carbon isotopic values in the organic matter, they may relate to a change in the boreal flux of organic matter, or they may relate to a shift in the dominant metabolism that is captured in these samples. So to look at the next piece of evidence that life might have been affected by the increase in iron, looking at these samples in a little more detail in thin section, and the first thing we notice is that they are full of siderite. So siderite is not something that is likely to have formed under normal Archean marine conditions, according to the work by Nick Tosca. Though we do have to, of course, consider that here we are talking about a giant meteorite impact. So these are not normal Archean conditions. But I would say that at least some of the siderite, we have some evidence that it was actually early diagenetic in origin. So for example, here, we see these siderites. These are little runs here that are, 10 to 30 micron in diameter. We oftentimes also see siderite as these like really small, about 3 micron spheres in the sediment. It's always associated with organic matter, and in many places, it's really directly associated. So here you see these like little clumps of organic matter, that's this cloudy dark material, just covered with siderite, indicating that there might be some kind of suggestion. And then also what we see is quite a bit of iron oxides, so hematites, and some magnetites. So I think magnetites might be secondary in origin. These hematite grains are submicron in scale, so really, really tiny. And then what we see in this image here is there's some kind of dehydration cracks that formed. And along these lines that's where we see some of the siderite forming. So yeah, it appears that at least some of the siderite might have been diagenetic in origin, and it appears to be some form of association with organic matter. So next, let's look at the carbon isotopic signature of the carbonates, because it might tell us something about the source of the carbon, right? Is it something that might have been derived from the organic matter itself, or is it something that might have come from the dissolved inorganic carbon within the water column? So when we look at the data here, it's ranging between about -2 to -8 per mol. There's some amount of variability here in these siderite-rich samples. And the values that we see here are pretty typical for Archean siderites, just with the difference being that siderites are really rarely found in shallow water, and that's what we are looking at here. What is really important is the question of course, what was the dissolved inorganic carbon? What was the carbon isotopic signature? And for that, we really need to compare to, just shallow water carbonates. Those are few and far in between in the Archean. There have been some studies on Archean carbonates, so calcites, dolomites, and most of those center around 0 per mol. And some of these samples from Weiser et al. In 1989 are from really close to the S2 spheral layer, so about 50 meters above. But of course, that's quite a distance. And I would say that the Archean, or at this time period, the composition of the DIC, we have just a really poor understanding of what it actually was. So that's kind of the big caveat here with the delta 13C of the carbonate. But putting all of this together, I think it does provide some possible evidence for microbial ion cycling, because what happens is that you have got iron 2+ that, after the impact is now available in the shallow water column. This might have triggered photoferrotrophy, which in turn will oxidize this iron 2+ to iron 3+. This will sink down as ferric oxyhydroxides into the sediment. And here it might have been used by dissimilatory ion reduction. So in the process, iron 3+ is reduced by using an electron from organic matter. And then we see the release of iron 2+ and CO2. But the process itself is a strong alkalinity pump and can trigger the formation of siderites. So tiny, like 5 micron siderite spheres have been observed in experiments. this siderite tends to have a negative carbon isotopic signature because carbon is used from organic matter that was previously, of course, reduced. And then, yes, some iron 2+ is released back into the water column and might, continue working its way through the ion cycling. So I would say that, each of these lines of evidence that I have shown you is non-unique, and there's many different ways to interpret it. But I think seeing the shift in delta 13C organic values, which might indicate a shift in dominant metabolism, then the association of iron 2 and iron 3 minerals really strongly associated with organic matter, the diagenetic origin of some of the siderite, and the light and variable delta 13C carbonate values provide some, are at least consistent with the possibility that there was microbial ion cycling going on. So with this, I would argue that the impact might have had a beneficial effect on the early biosphere, because with the increase in iron, we have a potential electron donor available in the photic zone, and we have got the enhanced input of phosphorus from weathering and erosion and bolide vaporization. So this might have really generated transient benefits for the early biosphere, especially for iron-based metabolisms. How long this lasted is really hard to say, because it's really tough to get at actual depositional rate or like ages that precisely in these rocks. I would say, maybe a few tens of thousands of years, if I had to guess. So putting it all together again, right? There's a number of environmental effects by the impact, and some of those would certainly have had disastrous effects on the biosphere. Again, especially photosynthesizing organisms would have been affected by partial ocean evaporation, darkness, and the tsunami sweeping by, where, female autotrophs might have not cared as much. But I would say, and I want to emphasize this, that we maybe need to shift our thinking a little more and thinking about possible positive effects of these impacts, as they might have generated a bloom, at least of iron-based metabolisms due to the effects of iron 2+ and nutrients. So putting this back again into the bigger picture, meteorite impacts during the early Earth certainly had disastrous effects, but many positive effects. Again, you have got the bolide that might have delivered materials, including amino acids, maybe even life itself. Then we have got a lot of proximal effects that might have been beneficial to prebiotic chemistry, but also to potential early life in the form of new habitats or refugia. So with this talk, I just want to emphasize that even in distal sites, so even potentially on the other side of the globe, the injection of nutrients and the mixing of the oceans might have had beneficial effects to the biosphere, making our little friends really happy. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. Again, this is still, it's not a finished product. We haven't published it yet. So I would really appreciate any thoughts or comments or advice. And I'm just going to leave the slide on with my silly little cartoon to guide our discussion.
All right, thanks, Nadja. You had a lot of really cool stuff in that. We're going to switch over to the question and discussion portion, and people can ask questions by either raising their hand with the reactions button or by typing it into the chat. And so before anybody, it doesn't look like anybody threw their hand up quickly. I guess I can start. I'm wondering so you showed, I guess, do you see any systematic changes in manganese and manganese concentrations or cerium anomaly? Because that can tell you more about how much oxygen, right?
So I haven't looked at manganese yet. I've looked at cerium and I don't see any changes.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, we did look at it because it could be that you just have like free oxygen production, and that's causing the increase in iron. But I couldn't see any change in the cerium anomaly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that seems to support your hypothesis there. Yeah.
Good question.
All right. And just let me know if you need to run. I just let everybody ask questions until they're done. So just let me know if you need to run. Andre, were you going to ask?
Yeah, Nadja, great talk. I have a few questions, so maybe I start with a couple more sort of specific. So I'm interested in your evaporates, and I'm wondering, so I presume evaporation happened very fast on a scale of maybe hours or days.
Yeah.
So is it a sufficient time for large crystals to grow? And the second, and related to it, if evaporation happened, water went into atmosphere and it was followed presumably by large rains that even if evaporates would form, would likely to dissolve them. So wondering if you thought about it and how you reconcile it.
Yeah, so to the first part of the question, I think, like how long did it take to evaporate that water? Like, wait, how long were the conditions hot enough that ocean waters would evaporate? So based on this modeling by Segura et al., it would be, maybe about a year. So not just a few days, but like quite a long time period. And I think once you're evaporating waters, that's going to have like some kind of compounding effect on this. The modeling at this point from 2013 is quite old. So that's something, like I'm just a geologist. I really want to get more modelers involved in this. So that is something that could be redone. But yeah, I think that, yes, you would have, at some point, the ocean would have to rain out again, right? If you evaporated tens of meters of the ocean. And this is maybe what we are seeing in the increase in siliciclastic influx, right? It's hot, we have a stronger hydrological cycle, stuff gets washed into the oceans maybe more frequently. Yes, you would be dissolving some of the evaporites. So these are ones that settled onto the sea floor in the water column. So it looks like something got preserved at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And another question. So it's interesting that you have multiple layers with spherules, and I'm wondering if we reflect one event or several events. So between them you have this organic redshirt, and presumably it took some time, like above 4 meters, took some time for it to be deposited. So is it possible that, for example, you have accumulation of spherules on a continent, and when you have sea level fall, you just bring in it with siliciclastic along in these channels into your environments?
Yeah,
or
I think
chemically different, could they be different events?
Yeah, I think so. What you're saying, I think it's certainly quite possible. I don't think we understand quite yet why we have 3 sandstone beds here that are so full of spherules, and really the top one is the one with the highest concentration of spherules out of all sandstones. And this is something we don't just see in Bruce's Hill. We see it in other sections associated with S2, but also S3, that sometimes there's multiple thicker sandstone beds here. Yeah, we are still honestly trying to figure it out. Yeah, it could be, resedimented spherules from, like higher lying areas. It could be, again, that the tsunami was reflected somewhere. It could be in much younger rocks where you have tsunami deposits. Sometimes you see 2 graded beds, and those might relate to just like the tsunami wave train coming by. Right, so the tsunami is not just a single wave, it's multiple waves. So maybe that is what we are seeing. But this is really something that we are still looking into at this point.
Thanks. Let others go, and I come back with another question.
Great.
Cool. The next one is from Benjamin Tutolo. Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, yeah, that was really awesome talk. I was wondering if you've done anything on the trace element composition of the siderites to say something about how they formed. Like, is there manganese in those siderites? Do you know anything about if there's calcium or magnesium in those siderites?
Yeah, so there's a little bit, I have to think that I might have to get back to you on this. So in most of the siderites, there's some calcium, manganese, magnesium in them. The only ones where it was almost pure just iron, it was when it's like in those like little cracks that I was showing you, the dehydration cracks. But yeah, other than that, we haven't looked that much into that yet.
Yeah, I think that might be helpful to trace these formation mechanisms. I think the overturning or the mixing of the ocean, you sort of still need a mechanism for nucleating siderite, but not making a whole bunch of calcium carbonate or something like that at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think it's coming back to the question in part, right? Is it nucleating in the water column or is it something early diagenetic? And, we have a giant impact. It gets really hot. We might see changes in the pH, right? So I think like both of those might be happening. I do want to emphasize again that in some parts, it does really look like it's early diagenetic, and just the really direct association with organic matter makes me think that there might be a connection there.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, next is Ava Stoikin. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks for your talk. That was great. I missed the first part of it, so you may have mentioned this already, but I was wondering, so with regards to effects for life, if these this impact could have also maybe brought in various kind of nutrients, and if you see evidence for maybe enrichment in some interesting metals, for example, I don't know, molybdenum, copper, zinc, things like that, that would have been beneficial to life.
Yeah, so I haven't looked into that yet. What I was mentioning like earlier in the talk is that we see an increase in phosphorus. And we see that associated with the increase in siliciclastic input, but also like really directly tied to the presence of spherules, which are, in part derived from the bolide. And that's where we see, up to 1,300 parts per million of phosphorus, which is incredibly high. It's 20 times higher compared to what we see that is background. So I do think that there's certainly some meteoritic contribution there that we are looking at. Again, big question is again how bioavailable it was, but I think with a really hot, aggressive weathering, I could imagine that we do have some release of bioavailable phosphorus.
Cool, thanks. Thank you.
Cool. Next up, Daryl, please go ahead.
That's an absolutely fascinating study you've done. It's really great. What I have problems with is water depth for both of these sections. I look at your stratigraphic column and I'd say that Bruce's Hill is the shallower of the two. I forgot what happened in your first slide. Was that true, or?
Yeah, that's what we think.
Okay.
We think that Bruce's Hill was shallower, simply because we do see these low energy current structures, so cross laminations, and we do see a higher abundance of siliciclastic detritus, indicating that we are, close to some kind of source to the siliciclastic material.
That will give you the opportunity to get these, given that you're in a rather unusual tectonic situation. You've got a lot of faulting going on, thrusting. The upper two layers could be tsunamites rather than the classic ones, not meteorite impact, but simply fault initiated.
So that these are by tsunamis instead of anything related to meteorite impact?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
the first one definitely with the spherules in it has to be a meteorite, but the second two don't. Yeah. And I don't think that I don't think the stratigraphy fits with these being sort of refraction waves or repeated trains of the same impact.
I mean, we are really quite open there.
Simply because you've got the fallout layer preserved. Given the rate of movement of those waves is like 1,200 meters per second or whatever, from an impact-induced wave, you wouldn't get time to settle any fine material out. You just get time to get the sand silt side out in each wave. So I think you have to rethink that part, or think about that part of the model. And another question I have, how far away do you think this impact was from your site?
It's really hard to tell. So it must have been more than 10 crater diameters away. But again, and I said this earlier, for all we know, we might be on the other side of the globe. Okay,
fine, thanks.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think with these upper two layers here, we haven't fully figured out yet what they represent. And I do think you're right, right? We need to still entertain all sorts of possibilities, whether related to the impact or not. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, next up is Christoph. Please go ahead.
Hi, Nadja. Yeah, what a wonderful talk. Very thought-provoking. I'm still looking at this diagram of Segura et al. 2013 that you still have on the screen. I am surprised by how long the ocean stays above the boiling point. It must be for close to, yeah, tens to hundreds of years, if I read this diagram correctly. And that would be really bad for the biosphere, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be bad. I mean, we're looking at it in Kelvin here. So the uppermost oceans would heat up quite a bit, and water would be boiling off. The deep ocean, right, might stay, sort of moderate. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I think anything that lived in the uppermost water column would have been extremely uncomfortable.
To put it mildly. It would, I wonder what it would do to the flocculation of organic material and so on. And the turbidity, of course. I mean, you're dealing with boiling water.
Yeah.
I'm well aware of Dawn's and Gary's paper here, 2015, that famous last sentence. But it must have been terrible. It must have been beyond imagination.
Yeah. No, I agree.
It would be really interesting to see some modeling of, like, if you have these temperatures in the atmosphere, how much, how much volume of the ocean can you host as actual water vapor before, like, the temperature gradient in the ocean kind of reaches eventual, like, habitable or just like non-boiling.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm just a lowly geologist, and I'm really trying to rope in some modelers here because, I can speak to the evidence that we see in the rock record, but it'd be really interesting to reduce some of the modeling, add some new modeling. Also thinking about, how much phosphorus and other micronutrients might the bolide carry into the, Earth environment. But that is stuff that really, needs to be modeled.
This might be a question that was certainly outside of what you were talking about, but maybe just generally, since but would this size of a scale of an impact kind of screw with have potential to mess with the Earth's eccentricity, the orbit, or rotation, stuff like this, or is it not quite there?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe someone else here could answer that question.
There's one in the chat from Case and Durst, or one. I'll ask that one. How has the chemocline changed from right before the impact and after the fallout layer, like the depth? And would considering atmospheric fractionation of the meteorite to a minor degree affect your conclusions?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. So the chemocline in our model, let me just go back to my little diagrams here. It's really hard to tell. I mean, like, even before the impact, it's hard to tell where exactly, at what water depth exactly the here we are. It's hard to say where exactly the chemocline was. We guess it's somewhere around storm wave base, because everywhere where we still see what we interpret as storm deposits, we just don't see a lot of iron-rich sediments. It's really once we do lose the storm deposits here. So the mixing by the tsunami would have brought some of this iron and rich deep water to the surface, like mixing it in, and it would take some time to fully reestablish the chemocline. But it's hard for me to say how long that would take. But I think maybe one aspect that the question is like pointing at is that there was a potential contribution of iron from the meteorite. So I do think it's quite possible. So carbonaceous chondrites can contain quite a bit of iron, I believe up to 20%. So that might have also had an effect here.
All right. We don't have anything else, no hands or anything. Andre, did you have more? You mentioned earlier.
Yeah, just a general question, Nadja. I'm kind of impressed with sort of in this older stuff, like in Archean, you have a lot of spherals layers, but no evidence for impact crater itself. And when you get to Rutherford, around 2 billion, and you have impact crater, but no spherals at that time. And I mean, it could be coincidence, but any idea what would you make out of it? Is it implies a smaller continental crust in early Archean, or is it just coincidence?
Yeah. Well, I think in part, of course, it's a preservation bias because only, about 5% of the rocks on Earth today are Archean in age. Then it might be, it's potentially less continental crust during the Archean. I think one thing that has always puzzled us is that we also don't see any shock quartz, right? So the spherical beds, you can really clearly see iridium anomalies, extraterrestrial chromium isotope signatures, and the spherical, textures look very much like, impact-related sphericals. But in younger impacts, what we often find are these shock features and quartz grains. And here the explanation is, that, there was possibly less continental crust around, and the impacts are just more likely to hit oceanic crust. And that type of crust, it's going to be lost fairly quickly because of plate tectonics at some point. But B, also, you have very little quartz in there, so you're just not generating these shock features that you see in younger impact deposits.
Thank you.
I guess it just seems to me like an interpretation could just be reworking of spherules that were kind of around at later times. Do you have reasons to kind of not think that?
So I'm not sure what you mean.
So these multiple spherical layers, I mean, is there a good reason that it shouldn't just be reworking like of spherical layers at, later times during regressive, transgressive cycles?
Do you mean like in the Boosted Hill section, or in general, any type of spherical bed?
Well, I guess in general, any type of spherical bed after the initial spherical bed.
So I think some of that can happen. My arguments would be that we see different spherical compositions for different spherical beds. So some of them have really markedly different textures and things like that. And then B, the spherical beds, they're massive compared to the KPG impact, but they're still relatively thin. So about 20 centimeters of detritus. So if you're reworking that, you're going to dilute it really quickly. So I think, like, based on both of those aspects, yes, it's possible, but I think it's unlikely.
Okay. We have one in the chat from Daniel Segesman. If a large enough impact hits the moon, which was far closer to the Earth in the Archean, do you think it's possible for ejecta from a major moon impact to deliver materials or dust to the Earth's surface? Where would there be geochemical signatures unique to an event like this that we could detect?
That's a really fun question.
Yeah.
Certainly, right? If you hit the moon and enough material has been blown away, some of it might make its way to Earth. I think with Earth, it just depends on the size of the material that is raining down. Right? If it's small, it's just going to burn up in the atmosphere, which is, hindering some of it. I think it's possible. I think, it's probably going to be hard to find. In terms of would there be any unique geochemical signatures? Sure. I would have to ask someone that actually studies the moon, but I'm sure there's some geochemical differences to Earth that, one might be able to look at.
All right, Daryl, go ahead.
Yeah, one comment, the lack of shock quartz may be because it's an oceanic impact. There's nothing there to shatter. On another point, have you any indication as to the character of the bolide?
Yeah, so this is not my work. It's work that was done, I think published maybe in 2003 by Frank Kite in collaboration with Dawn and Gary. So they looked at the chromium isotope signature of the impact layers, and they found that they had extraterrestrial negative signatures that would indicate that there might have been carbonaceous chondrites.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, that's it for anything in the chat or hands up. A few more seconds in case someone wants to speak up.
Yeah, and otherwise I'm always happy to chat about this. So if anyone has any more questions or like interesting discussion points or thoughts, please feel free to email me.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that concludes it. So thanks a bunch, Nadja. Hopefully you did get to rope in some people. It's really interesting material to work on. So very excited for you about this. This was great.
Okay, thank you again so much for having me. Bye bye.
Yeah, thanks everybody. See you next week.
Bye.